Have you ever been in a room full of people, laughing, talking, music playing, and still felt like you were watching it all from behind glass? Like you were there, but not quite there. Present in body, but somewhere else entirely in mind, somewhere quieter, somewhere deeper. And maybe you smiled when you were supposed to smile, said the right things at the right moments. But underneath all of it, some part of you was already analyzing the conversation, replaying something someone said 3 days ago, or wondering what any of this actually means. People call it being in your head. They say it like it's a flaw, like there's something wrong with the fact that your mind refuses to stay on the surface. But what if there's nothing wrong with you at all? What if the way you think isn't a glitch, but the cost of something much more interesting? Most people assume that deep thinkers are simply smart, that it's an intellectual gift, a sign of curiosity, of complexity, of a mind that just works differently. And sure, that's part of it. But here's what's often misunderstood. Deep thinking, the relentless, exhausting, beautiful, maddening kind, is rarely just a personality trait. It's not something most deep thinkers chose the way you choose a hobby or a career. It developed. It grew in response to something. And for a lot of people who live inside their own minds more than anywhere else, that something has a very specific shape. See, for some people, the world never quite felt safe enough to simply be in, not fully. Not without watching it carefully first, and thinking. Deep, constant, analytical thinking became the way they learned to navigate that. Here's the central paradox that nobody talks about: the people who understand everyone around them the most are often the ones who feel the least understood themselves. They read rooms. They notice subtleties. They feel the shift in someone's tone before the person knows they've shifted. They carry entire emotional landscapes for other people, and yet they sit alone with their own interior, vast, complex, endlessly alive, wondering if anyone will ever really see them. That's not just depth. That's something older than depth. It usually starts early, not always with something dramatic, not always with a single defining wound that you can point to and say, that's where it began. Sometimes it starts with a household that was unpredictable, a parent whose moods changed like weather you couldn't forecast, a childhood where the emotional atmosphere required constant reading, where being tuned in wasn't a choice but a survival skill. When you grow up in an environment where things feel uncertain, your nervous system learns to do something remarkable. It starts paying attention, deeply, exhaustively, constantly. It begins scanning for signals, not just what people are saying, but what they mean. Not just what's happening, but what might happen next. And because that kind of hyperattention often protected you, because noticing things worked, because anticipating kept you safe, your mind learned to never fully stop. Think of it like a lake. On the surface, the water might look still, calm, even glassy. People walk past it and see something peaceful, something composed, something that doesn't make a lot of noise. But underneath there are currents. There's movement and depth and entire ecosystems that the surface never shows. And the lake doesn't get to choose whether to have them. The depth was always there. That's what it's like inside the mind of a deep thinker. Still on the surface, relentless underneath. And here's the part most people never admit. Including the deep thinkers themselves, it is exhausting. Not occasionally, chronically. Because a mind that never truly rests, a mind that is always processing, always connecting, always meaning, making, that mind doesn't get the same kind of quiet that other minds seem to find so naturally. You lie awake at night, not because something is wrong, but because your brain found a new thread and started pulling it. You replay conversations not because you're insecure, but because something in what was said didn't quite add up and your mind needs to understand it. You feel other people's emotions not just emotionally, but physically. in your chest, in the back of your throat, in the way the air in a room changes when someone is hurting. And you absorb all of it. What does that do to a person over time? What does it cost? Quietly, invisibly, in the private hours. To think at that depth, to feel at that intensity, to understand so much and still feel so profoundly alone with your own understanding. Because this is where it gets complicated. The very thing that makes you remarkable, the depth, the perception, the rich inner world, also creates a specific kind of loneliness that's hard to put language to. It's not the loneliness of having no one around. You might be surrounded by people who love you. It's the loneliness of having something inside you that you can't quite translate. A sense that the conversation you actually want to have, the real one, the one beneath the small talk, the one that would take all night and still feel unfinished, is a conversation most people aren't willing to sit in. And slowly, without realizing it, you start to keep the depth to yourself. You learn to edit, to translate yourself down into something more digestible, to offer people the surface version, because the full version tends to make them uncomfortable, or quiet, or, and this is the one that cuts deepest, they look at you like you're too much. So you become skilled at two things simultaneously, knowing people deeply and hiding yourself from being known. Psychologists call the mental pattern at the center of this rumination. It describes the mind's tendency to return again and again to the same thoughts, the same questions, the same unresolved emotional material, not to torture itself, but because it hasn't found resolution yet, and it won't rest until it does. Rumination is often talked about as a problem, something to be fixed, and in its extreme forms it can spiral into anxiety, into depression, into a paralysis that makes it hard to simply move through the day. But here's what the research actually tells us. A study published in the journal Psychological Science found that people who engage in deeper reflective thinking, even when that thinking is uncomfortable, consistently demonstrate higher levels of emotional intelligence, stronger interpersonal empathy, and a greater capacity for meaning, making in adversity. The depth isn't just suffering. The depth is also wisdom in progress. There's another layer to this, though. Many deep thinkers carry what researchers call hypervigilance, a nervous system that was calibrated, often in early life, to monitor for threat. Not necessarily physical threat, emotional threat, social threat, the threat of rejection, of misattunement, of being in a room and suddenly feeling like the emotional floor has dropped out. Hypervigilance describes a state where the brain's threat detection system, the part that evolved to keep us safe, is running on a higher sensitivity than the current environment actually requires. It's like a smoke detector set so finely it goes off when you make toast. Nothing is actually burning, but the alarm is real. For deep thinkers, this means the mind is often processing far more input than others around them, picking up signals, running scenarios, preparing responses, even in situations that most people experience as simple and unremarkable. And then there's what the philosopher and psychologist Irvin Yalom called existential isolation. The unavoidable experience of knowing that no matter how deeply two people connect, there is always a layer of inner experience that cannot be fully transmitted, that cannot be truly shared. Most people brush up against this occasionally. Deep thinkers live there. They know, in a bone-deep way, that even in the most intimate conversations, even in the closest relationships, some part of their experience remains untranslatable. Not because they're failing at communication, but because the interior is simply too vast for the language available. But here's what this also means, and this matters. If you have a mind like this, you are not broken. You are not defective. You are not pathologically overthinking your way through life. What you're experiencing is the natural consequence of a perceptual system tuned to extraordinary sensitivity. And that sensitivity, in the right conditions, is one of the most powerful things a human being can carry. Now, Let's pause here for a moment. If any of this sounds familiar, if you've ever felt the exhaustion of a mind that won't quiet down, the loneliness of being understood on the surface but not beneath it, the strange experience of feeling deeply connected to others and yet deeply alone inside your own experience, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not too much. You never were. What was called overthinking was often care. What was called being sensitive was perception. What was called too intense was simply depth meeting, a world that hadn't learned to hold it yet. You learned to make yourself smaller to fit spaces that weren't built for the size of what you carry. You learned to translate yourself, to edit, to offer the version of you that didn't require people to sit in discomfort or wade into water they didn't know how to swim in. And that was intelligent. That was adaptive. At the time, it may have been the only thing that worked. But here's what I want you to know. The depth was never the problem. You were never the problem. You are someone who feels the full weight of being alive. And in a world that moves fast and stays shallow and mistakes busyness for meaning, that is quietly, extraordinarily rare. The people who changed things, who created things, who saw things no one else saw, who understood the human condition in ways that outlasted their lifetimes. They were almost always people who could not stay on the surface, who could not think, who were condemned by their own perception to go further, feel more, understand deeper. That's the company your mind belongs to. You're not alone in it, and you never were. So how do we hold all of this? How does a deep thinker learn to carry the depth without being swallowed by it? How do you honor the way your mind works without letting it become the place you disappear into? The answer isn't dramatic. It rarely is. The first thing, and this is quieter than it sounds, is to stop treating your depth like a problem that needs to be solved. You have spent years, maybe decades, trying to think your way to a place where the thinking finally stops. Trying to resolve enough, understand enough, process enough that the mind finally goes quiet. But the lake doesn't stop being deep by wishing itself shallow. What changes is your relationship to the depth. What changes is learning to stand at the edge of it without feeling like you have to jump in every time. Noticing the current without always swimming against it. Consider too the practice of choosing your depth deliberately. Deep thinkers often go deep involuntarily, pulled under by a thought, a feeling, a conversation that replays. But depth can also be intentional. You can choose when to dive and when to stay at the surface, not because the surface is better, but because not every moment requires the full weight of your perception. Some things are allowed to just be simple. Some conversations are allowed to just be light. And you are allowed to be in them without excavating everything for meaning. Notice also who you are in the presence of. There is a particular kind of person, rare but real, who doesn't need you to translate yourself down. Who can sit inside a long silence without filling it? Who asks the second question and then the third? Who isn't frightened by the lake? Who wants to swim in it with you? Those people exist, and allowing yourself to be known by them fully, without the editing, without the managed version, is one of the bravest things a deep thinker can do. Because vulnerability, for a mind like yours, isn't casual. You know too well what it costs. You've seen too clearly what happens when you give someone access to the interior and they treat it carelessly. But the alternative, the sealed life, the performed surface, the connection that stays comfortable but never real, that has a cost too. And you already know it. You've been paying it. Allow yourself, when you can, to be known. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, extend to yourself the same quality of understanding you extend to everyone else. You are so good at holding space for other people's complexity, at finding the logic inside their pain, the reason inside their behavior, the humanity inside their worst moments. You do it almost automatically, almost generously. Now, what would it mean to do that for you? To look at the parts of yourself that feel like too much. The late nights thinking, the replayed conversations, the feelings that arrive before you've had a chance to catch them. And instead of labeling them problems, seeing them as evidence of something that has always been true about you, that you are someone who takes being alive seriously. That is not a flaw. It is, in fact, a gift, even when it doesn't feel like one. So the next time you find yourself awake at 2 a.m. with a mind that won't settle, sitting with a question that doesn't have an easy answer, pause before you call it a problem. Ask yourself instead, what is this depth trying to tell me? Because beneath all the processing, beneath all the analysis and the replaying and the reaching for meaning, there is something your mind has always been trying to do. Something it has been doing since the beginning. It has been trying to make sense of a world that doesn't always make sense. It has been trying to find the truth beneath the surface. It has been trying, in its tireless, relentless, beautiful way, to understand what it means to be here. And that, in the end, is not a burden. That is the whole point of being alive. The depth was never what was wrong with you. The depth was always what made you, you.